This is lecture 24. In the last two lectures, we've been talking about the endocrine system, and so we'll finish up our series on hormones today. These are the three topics we'll cover. Hormone actions is a broad one, but we'll cover a portion of that breadth, in addition to the difference between anabolic and catabolic hormones, and we'll begin with binding proteins. Um, so hormones in the blood have binding proteins. These are proteins that are bound to it. And binding proteins exist for both steroid and polypeptide hormones. Some of the hormone will circulate around unbound in the blood. That's the free hormone, it's unbound. But most of your hormones are going to be bound to binding proteins. So an example of one of these, of a hormone that's totally bound up, is IGF-1, insulin-like growth factor 1. IGF-2 exists. It's more about fetal growth, and then IGF-1 is adult growth. So that's the one we'll focus on. And 98%, about roughly 98% of your IGF-1 is bound to binding proteins. There are six different ones: IGF-BP1, IGF-BP2, IGF-BP3, and so on up to six. The third one, IGF binding protein 3, IGF-BP3, that's the main one. It's about 80% of all of your IGF is bound to that one protein. You can see the like, angry, like, menacing looking Pac-Man. That's a protease. It's an enzyme that'll break down, in this case, binding proteins, freeing up the IGF, which is what allows it to bind. So let's talk about the functions of your binding proteins. There are three or five functions, depending on what you count as a unique entry here. The first two on the list are basically the same thing: fight degradation and extend half-life. Those are often listed as separate functions, but they're really the same. Uh, Binding proteins permit your blood to be a site for storage. Numbers three and four are also kind of the same thing. If a binding protein is bound to the hormone in the blood, the hormone can't bind to its receptor, so that makes it inactive, and that's modulating the hormone's activity. So three and four are kind of the same thing. And then number five, binding proteins also increase the hormone's solubility in the blood. So lots of hormones, steroid and polypeptide both, as well as icosanoids and other proteins like cytokines that aren't really classic hormones. Lots of these have anabolic effects. There's a list of some anabolic ones up top. That top paragraph, that's anabolic hormones and hormone molecules. And then lots of them have catabolic effects too. Hormones and steroid hormones and polypeptide hormones and whatever, like cytokines. And so these catabolic ones promote the breakdown rather than the buildup. And there's a roster of some of the catabolic ones in the lower paragraph there. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that muscle is multinucleated. One muscle cell has multiple myonuclei, multiple muscle nucleuses. Because the cell is huge, a muscle cell tends to be huge. And you have to be able to genetically control the entire cell's breadth, the entire cell's domain. So one government can't control the whole world. You need regional governments. Every state in the US has its own government. Every city has its own government. It's the same thing with any big cell. It needs to be segregated into tiny cities, smaller governable domains, and the nucleus is in control of each of those little domains. The growth of a muscle cell is controlled by each little kind of nucleus domain. So one of the things that needs to happen for hypertrophy to occur is you need to increase the number of myonuclei. You need to increase the number of nucleuses in a single muscle cell. So that tends to precede growth, and we see hormones doing some, like steroid, testosterone having some of those effects, which we'll talk about in the future. So there are different anabolic and catabolic pathways. Here are some big ones. These aren't the only ones, but here are a few. In catabolic, you see the lysosome and proteasome listed. We'll come back to these, but lysosomal protein degradation is non-selective. It doesn't discriminate what it's degrading, while the ubiquitin proteasome system is selective protein degradation. And that's all you really need to know for now. And then you see myostatin listed also. We'll talk about that one in just a second, but let's look at the anabolic pathways first, from the bottom to the top. Androgens, that's endogenous anabolic steroids. DHEA, androstenedione, testosterone, and dihydrotestosterone. Those are the androgens. Those are your anabolic androgenic steroids that are endogenous. And then we have the major anabolic peptide hormone, non-steroid hormone, a peptide hormone. That's insulin-like growth factor, IGF, IGF-1. And that one works through mTOR signaling, which will be the major topic of this block soon. We'll get to it soon. Then on top, you see follistatin. That's anabolic too, because it's a binding protein of myostatin. And myostatin is extremely catabolic. So if follistatin binds to it, it's deactivating it, it's preventing myostatin from exerting its action. And if you prevent a catabolic thing from binding to its receptor, that's the same thing. That's tantamount to an anabolic effect. So follistatin again, it's a binding protein of myostatin, and myostatin is a myokine, meaning a cytokine that's released from muscle, a myokine, which means it's a small signaling protein that muscles release to regulate their metabolism. And follistatin binds to it. Follistatin is given as a drug to cachectic patients. So if you have HIV related muscle wasting, cancer related muscle, something like that, um, follistatin can help preserve that muscle. It prevents myostatin from preventing muscle growth. So it's an anti-catabolic binding protein. And then down at the bottom right, that's a Belgian blue cow. They're selectively bred to have a dysfunctional form of myostatin, a premature stop codon. If you know how genetics work, you get a truncated version of the protein, which doesn't function. Um, Another look at some animals without myostatin, animals without that catabolic signal, um, animals that lost the regulation of hypertrophy. And the only mechanism you need to know about what myostatin is doing is the inhibition of PKB, AKT or PKB, two different names for the exact same thing. And PKB is the major enzymatic pathway for anabolism. This is upstream from mTOR. And so if you inhibit this, you're not anabolic, you're not growing. Getting into IGF, this is a peptide hormone. It's a um, uh, endocrine hormone, as it'll be produced in the liver. That's not the only way to produce it, but the HPL axis, the hypothalamic pituitary liver. So that would be its endocrine function, but it's also produced in a autocrine and paracrine way. So mechanical actions in the skeletal muscle will stimulate the release of mechano growth factor. You'll see it called sometimes, but this is IGF coming from the muscle. And it's also produced from fat cells, but most of your IGF, your endocrine IGF, is coming from the liver, which means your liver is an extremely anabolic gland. It just has a bunch of critical organ functions too, so nobody thinks of the liver as a gland. Um, because it's not just specialized for hormones, but it does have that glandular function. Um, IGF, the production in the liver, as you know, is stimulated by growth hormone released from the anterior pituitary, but it's not immediate. It's hours later, lots of hours. It means like at least 8 hours later. It's a long time after your growth hormone, the liver responds. But remember, the IGF stands for insulin-like growth factor. It's physically like insulin, um, which means the that insulin and IGF, they can both activate each other's receptors. They don't have as strong of affinity for the other, but if you were to immediately unbind all of your IGF, just load your blood with proteases that degrade its binding proteins, freeing up the 98% of your IGF that's bound, you'd go into a diabetic coma. Regulation of this is really, really important. But IGF can perform some of insulin's effects on behalf or for insulin, instead of insulin. So like in people who have diabetes, even type 1 diabetes, they can manage blood glucose with IGF. It's just not the ideal hormone for that purpose. So nobody's really trying to do that. So moving into androgens, as you know, these are steroid hormones, meaning they're made from cholesterol, so they're fat soluble, which means they can diffuse across the membrane of a muscle cell and bind to the androgen receptors inside of the cell, and then exert their effects on transcription. This is a look at the diurnal rhythm of testosterone. Diurnal and nocturnal both refer to a day-night cycle. If you're diurnal and you're not nocturnal, you're a daytime critter. And testosterone has a daily cycle in which it drops during the day and it rises at night while you're sleeping. And this is in young males. It's not really true for females or older males. You don't have a big pronounced cycle like this. But men in general have maybe 15 to 20 times higher testosterone levels than women. Women have much lower testosterone levels, and their serum concentrations of blood values don't vary much throughout the day. But in young males, testosterone has a diurnal rhythm. And lots of functions in androgens. That's all this is showing you is some of the varied functions, but hypertrophy, protein synthesis, that's the only one we're going to be focusing on. And diet, what you're eating, your nutrition, that affects androgen levels and estrogen levels, and lots of other hormones. But this is a study that evaluated males age 50 to 63, and they controlled their diet. They controlled the subject's diet. Some of them were switched to a low-fat, high-fiber diet. Other subjects were switched to a low-fat, high-fiber diet, and then to a high-fat diet. And then the last group of subjects were switched to a high-fat diet first, and then they were switched to a low-fat, high-fiber diet. And they did see cholesterol drop in the low fat, high fiber dieters. They saw cholesterol drop. That's what people do these diets for. So if that didn't work, it'd be disappointing. But LDLs and HDLs both drop. And HDLs, those are the good ones. So it'd be nice if you could keep the HDLs and selectively, reduce your LDLs. But that's not really what you see happening. You just see this kind of drop across the board. But among the across the board dropping, androgens drop too, all of them, and estrogen, estradiol. But these are all males, so there isn't much estrogen here anyway. But SHBG, that's sex hormone binding globulin, that decreases too. It's a binding protein. And so everything related to testosterone falls, which makes sense because in a low fat, certainly low cholesterol, high fiber diet, you're eliminating the ingredients to manufacture it, to manufacture your estrogens. So this is just a look at what the actual values were in the study. The subjects who went on the high fat diet first drove their testosterone levels up from baseline. But the ones who went on the low fat diet and reduced their testosterone, when they switched to the high fat diet, they recovered, but not completely. They didn't recover all the way. They didn't get all their testosterone back. And these are 8-week periods. So what that means is 8 weeks wasn't sufficient, wasn't long enough to recover after the low fat, high fiber diet, to recover androgen levels. Now, estrogen is a lot more complicated than testosterone. It is anabolic, in ways we'll talk about soon, but it's catabolic too in ways we'll talk about soon. So later in this block, we'll get back to it. But estrogen um, does have both anabolic and catabolic effects. Getting into growth hormone, this isn't a steroid hormone. It's a protein hormone, but it's not just one hormone. There are numerous versions of growth hormone, different variants of it, tons of them. Um, and there are several ways to increase levels, your growth hormone levels. And one of them is sleep, right? GH has a diurnal rhythm too. Get a good night's sleep, and you'll have a pronounced growth hormone release, a growth hormone response in a long night's sleep. And which means sleep deprivation is going to reduce your growth hormone levels. One night of bad sleep is fine. You'll rebound. But if you make it a habit, if it's just night after night you're sleeping poorly, you don't rebound effectively there. Um, and then another way to increase growth hormone is exercise, intense exercise. You're going to want to get a bunch of lactate. We've talked about this in the previous lectures, where lactate is a major trigger for growth hormone release. And then fasting can do it too. During fasting, your stomach and little GI tract will release ghrelin, GHRLN, growth hormone releasing Ln. And so this is going to stimulate the release of growth hormone also. But that doesn't mean that fasting, which is the trigger for ghrelin to be released, and ghrelin triggers growth hormone, that doesn't mean fasting is anabolic, because if you fast, and that's how you stimulate your growth hormone release. You don't complete the HPL axis. You don't get the big IGF activity. All that big surge doesn't follow. And so IGF really does the anabolic effects that we credit to growth hormone. So fasting is not an anabolic activity despite the elevated growth hormone. And then growth hormone, it operates through a signaling cascade that we're not really going to go over. JAK stat, that's what this is right here. In this block, we're going to focus on PKB, PKB mTOR, and then also MAPK, mitogen activated protein kinase. Those are the two major pathways for turning on protein translation. Let's synthesize some proteins. But there are other signaling cascades that exist that we just won't be covering in any detail. And this is one of them. And on the left, you see different things that increase during exercise. So growth hormone does spike, right? But it can take a little while to do that spiking. And you know how growth hormone is released. It's a hypothalamic pituitary, eventually to the liver axis. The anterior pituitary is what's releasing the growth hormone, and then the liver releases the IGF and it's, the binding proteins. But IGF, again, that's really what's doing the tissue anabolism. We just credit growth hormone for doing it. Which is just upstream from the IGF. So it's very influential, but it's not doing the labor. Also from the hypothalamus is somatostatin. This inhibits growth hormone release. So the hypothalamus regulates the pituitary both positively and negatively. But an excess of growth hormone, this is called acromegaly or gigantism. This will make a person huge, like Andre the Giant huge. That was Andre the Giant's, perk and problem. And that's a normal sized beer can in his hand on the right there. That's not a mini can. That's just how big his hands were. But his teeth look tiny because growth hormone doesn't change the teeth. So people with acromegaly appear to have little baby teeth, but they don't. Those are normal teeth, just like the beer can was normal. It's just that everything else is huge. So growth hormone doesn't target every single thing in your body. So in summary, growth hormone does a lot of functions. It has a lot of actions. It increases lipolysis. So it's catabolic with fat, but it's anabolic with everything else, right? Cartilage and bone and muscle. Your non-fat tissues are going to grow. Well, maybe not their teeth, but then it also enhances immune function at the same time. It stimulates lymphocytes and macrophages. And then the last hormone we'll talk about today are the thyroid hormones, right? T3 and T4, triiodothyronine and thyroxine. These come from the HPT axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. And the thyroid hormones, these are synthesized from tyrosine amino acid and iodine. And it seems like there would be catabolic because hyperthyroidism is an overproduction of T3 and T4s and Graves' disease. This causes weight loss. So it seems like this would be catabolic. And then hypothyroidism, an underproduction of T3 and T4, associates with weight gain. But the thyroid hormones stimulate protein synthesis. It's just metabolically incredibly expensive. Anabolism has a high price tag, and you have to eat to support that. So this is a look. Let's talk about that anabolism in a very specific way. This is a look at MyoD expression. MyoD being myogenic differentiation factor. It's a protein. Factors are proteins, and this factor influences muscle growth. It's a transcription factor for muscle differentiation and development. And MyoD expression is partly controlled positively by thyroid signaling. So what the graph is looking at is knocking out the transporters that get the thyroid hormones into the cell. So remember, it's a amine hormone, it's made from tyrosine, but its receptors aren't on the cell surface. They're inside of the cell. So it's unique in that way, different from other hormones in the polypeptide class, protein and peptide and amine hormones. This is a different one. But it's also not a steroid hormone. So it can't just wander through the cell membrane unchaperoned. It needs to be escorted across a cell membrane by a transporter. So on the left in the graph, that's wild type. That's what WT stands for, meaning the transporters aren't impaired. The second bar is impairing one transporter. The third bar is impairing a different transporter to get T3, T4 into the cell. And then that last bar is impairing both transporters. And so you can see a substantial reduction in MyoD, which means you see a substantial reduction in anabolism. And thyroid hormones are also activating PKB, protein kinase B, AKT or PKB. Remember, that's the same thing, just different names for the same enzyme. And that turns on mTOR signaling, which is the primary enzymatic pathway for anabolism, but it's really metabolically expensive. Now, exercise doesn't always increase, all these hormones. With consistent aerobic exercise, you can see testosterone and thyroxine here going down. Cortisol, though, you see that one going up, and cortisol is a major catabolic hormone. So the type of exercise you do is going to influence your endocrine response, and that will influence whether you're catabolic or anabolic. The type of exercise does matter. So for males hoping to gain muscle through exercise, avoiding excesses of aerobic exercise would be advisable. There's such a thing as exercise induced hypogonadal, like that condition in which testosterone levels are chronically reduced, as though you're on a low fat, high fiber diet. You see a similar effect on testosterone. But one thing to keep in mind is that diet and exercise influence each other. So males doing a lot of cardio may be able to mitigate some of those effects, some of those hypogonadal effects, the reduction of testosterone through dietary manipulation. And that's where we'll end. Here's a look at everything we've just talked about. Um, and so the review questions, what to pay attention to, what to take with you. And I will see you in the next lecture when we get into anabolic androgenic steroids.